The cave had been silent for 11 hours. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you question whether you've already lost your hearing. Elena Vasquez pressed her back against the cold limestone wall and listened to herself breathe. In, out, in, out. Each breath a small victory, each exhale a waste of warmth she couldn't afford to lose. Her headlamp was dead. Her left ankle was wrong, bent at an angle that made her stomach turn when she first looked at it. So she stopped looking. Somewhere ahead, maybe 20 feet, maybe 200, water dripped onto stone. A steady, indifferent rhythm. Drip, drip, drip. She couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. And somewhere behind her, buried under several tons of fractured limestone, was the only tunnel she knew led back to the surface. And she was 39 years old. She was a mother. She was a geologist with 14 years of field experience, and she had no idea if anyone was coming for her. The question she kept asking herself, the one that would haunt every single moment of the next 2 weeks, was simple. How long can a person survive on hope alone? Elena hadn't planned to go deep. That needs to be said clearly because the story of how someone ends up trapped underground for 14 days often begins with a bad decision. People assume recklessness. They picture a thrill seeker pushing limits, ignoring warnings. Elena was the opposite of that. She was methodical, careful. The kind of woman who triple-checked her equipment and left detailed route plans with 2 separate people before entering any cave system. Her colleagues at the university called her the safest person they'd ever worked with underground. She had entered Cerro Negro, the Black Hollow, a known but partially unmapped limestone cave system in the mountains of northern Spain, for a documentation survey, routine work. She'd been inside the upper chambers dozens of times over 5 years. The university needed updated maps of a specific passage about 400 meters in. A 4-hour job, maybe 5. She told her partner Marco she'd be back before dinner. She remembers thinking as she squeezed through the entrance that morning that the rock above the threshold looked slightly different than last time. A small crack she hadn't noticed before. She noted it mentally, told herself to report it. She did not turn back. And that is the one decision she would replay every single day for the rest of her life. She was 3 hours in when the mountain moved, not dramatically, not like an explosion. It was more like the cave cleared its throat, a deep, resonant groan that traveled through the rock and into her bones. Then from somewhere behind her, a sound like the earth swallowing itself. A slow, grinding collapse that built in seconds into something enormous. Elena ran. She ran the wrong way. In the chaos of the shaking, dust filling her beam of light, small rocks raining from the ceiling, she took a left where she should have taken a right. A simple mistake. The kind that takes 3 seconds and costs everything. She ran until the shaking stopped, until the dust began to settle, until she could hear her own heartbeat again. Then she turned around, and the passage behind her was gone, not blocked. Gone. The ceiling had come down in a section roughly 8 meters long, filling the tunnel floor to roof with compacted limestone and debris. She pressed her hands against it, pushed, pulled at loose rocks until her fingers bled. Nothing moved. She stood there in the beam of her headlamp, bleeding hands at her sides, breathing hard, and understood with complete, terrible clarity that she had made a mistake that could not be undone in the next few minutes. She forced herself to sit down, to breathe, to think. She took inventory: 1 headlamp fully charged, 2 spare batteries, a half-liter of water, 2 protein bars, a basic first aid kit, her survey notebook, a compass, a thermal emergency blanket, her phone, which showed no signal and never would. She looked at the supplies spread on the cave floor. She looked at the collapsed passage behind her. She looked at the darkness stretching ahead into unmapped territory. There was no easy way out. She knew that immediately. The question was whether there was a hard way out. She picked up her gear and moved forward. The first 3 days are the hardest to describe, not because nothing happened, but because everything happened inside her head. Her ankle was sprained, not broken. She determined this through careful, agonizing manipulation that left her nauseous on the cave floor for 20 minutes. She wrapped it tightly with bandaging from the kit and told herself she could walk. She could walk. She repeated this until it became true. She mapped as she moved. Old instinct, geologist's habit, even in crisis. And her hands kept drawing in the notebook, marking junctions, noting ceiling height, recording the direction and slope of passages. Later, she would say this habit probably saved her mind before it saved her life. It gave her something structured to do. It turned the cave from a trap into a problem. A problem can be solved, a trap cannot. She found water on the second day. A thin seep running down a wall of pale flowstone collecting in a shallow depression in the floor. She stared at it for a long time before she let herself feel relief. The water was cold and faintly mineral. She filled her bottle. She rationed it with the discipline of someone who understood on a cellular level that dehydration would come for her before starvation did. She allowed herself 1 small sip of water every 2 hours. No exceptions. In the protein bars, she broke into segments. 8 pieces total. 1 piece per meal. 3 meals a day. That was just over 2.5 days of food. After that, she would need to find another source, or she would need to stop moving and conserve what energy she had left. On the 3rd day, curled under her emergency blanket in a narrow side passage she had chosen for its slightly warmer air, she allowed herself to cry. Not long, controlled, the way she did everything. She thought about her daughter, Sophia, who was 7 years old and afraid of the dark. She thought about Marco, who would be searching. She thought about the look on her mother's face if the phone call came. Then she stopped crying, folded her blanket, checked her ankle, and started moving again. But that wasn't the worst part. In days 4 through 7 taught her things about herself she had never wanted to know. The cave system was larger than any existing map suggested. She found that both terrifying and, in her quieter moments, genuinely fascinating. Passages branched and looped. She discovered a chamber so large her headlamp couldn't reach the far wall. An underground room the size of a cathedral, its ceiling lost in darkness above her. She stood at its edge and felt something she could only describe as awe, followed immediately by the specific loneliness of experiencing something extraordinary with no one to share it with. She found evidence of water flow, dry riverbeds carved smooth by ancient underground rivers. She followed one because where water flows there is sometimes a way out. The riverbed narrowed, then widened, and then dropped sharply into a sump, a passage flooded floor to ceiling with black water of unknown depth and unknown length. She sat at the edge for an hour. The water was cold enough that she could feel the temperature drop from 3 feet away. Entering it without knowing what was on the other side would be a death sentence. She turned back. On day 5, she found mushrooms growing on a piece of waterlogged wood in a damp side passage. She was not a mycologist. She knew enough to know that cave fungi were generally not poisonous the way surface fungi could be, and she knew that she was running out of protein. She ate 3 small specimens, waited 4 hours. When nothing terrible happened, she ate more. They tasted like wet paper and cold mud. They kept her going. On day 6, she found something that stopped her completely. It scratched into the wall of a low crawlway, at a height suggesting a person lying flat had made them, were marks. Deliberate marks, not geological formations. Letters, or something like letters, worn smooth by time and moisture but unmistakably human in origin. She traced them with her fingers in the dark. She counted 17 individual marks, some grouped, some alone. Someone had been here before, not a survey team, not a modern explorer. The marks had the look of age, decades at minimum, possibly much longer. Someone had been in this cave. Someone had reached this point, this exact crawlway, and had left marks on the wall. She asked herself the question she didn't want to ask. Had they made it out? She didn't answer it. She kept moving. Her days 8 through 10 were when the cave stopped being a physical problem and became a psychological one. Sleep was difficult, not because of discomfort. She had adapted to the cold and the hard surfaces with a kind of grim pragmatism. The problem was the dark. When she turned off her headlamp to save battery, the darkness was so complete it had physical weight. She couldn't see, couldn't orient. In that darkness, her brain began to fill the void. She heard things, breathing at first. She told herself it was the cave, systems of passages creating acoustic effects that mimicked the rise and fall of breath. She had read about this. It was known. It was explainable. Then she heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from a passage she had already explored and confirmed as a dead end. She turned on her headlamp. The passage was empty, and she walked its entire length. Nothing. No animal, no loose rock, no dripping water that could have created the sound. She went back to her resting spot and sat with her light on until the battery percentage dropped enough that she forced herself to turn it off. The footsteps came again. This was day 8. By day 9, she had stopped trying to explain the sounds. She documented them in her notebook the way she documented everything: time, location, duration, characteristics. She treated them like data. It was the only way to maintain the separation between what was real and what her exhausted, hungry mind was manufacturing. On day 9, she made a decision that she knew was dangerous. She had found a second crawlway during her mapping, running roughly parallel to the main passage, and it was tighter, barely shoulder width, and sloped upward at an angle that suggested it might connect to a higher section of the cave. Higher passages sometimes connected to surface entrances. It was thin logic, desperate logic, but the alternative was to stay where she was. She had been underground for 9 days. Her food was gone. Her water seep was adequate, but barely. Her body was weakening in ways she could measure precisely. Slower thinking, muscle weakness, the slightly delayed way her responses came now. Like signals traveling through damaged wiring. She decided she would attempt the crawlway on day 10, after resting. On the morning of day 10, she woke to find the main passage she had been living in partially flooded. The water was 8 inches deep and rising, so she had perhaps 20 minutes to gather her things and move. She hadn't planned to take the crawlway yet. The cave had decided for her. The crawlway was worse than it looked. She entered head first, pushing her pack ahead of her, dragging herself forward on her elbows. The limestone pressed against her back. In places, she had to exhale completely to squeeze through, deflate her lungs to reduce her body's volume by fractions of an inch. The incline was steeper than she'd estimated. After 90 minutes of crawling, her elbows were raw and her shoulders screamed. Then the passage widened. Sharply, unexpectedly. She pulled herself out of the crawlway into a space large enough to kneel in, then to stand, barely, and found herself at the edge of a short drop into a lower chamber she had not mapped. Her headlamp swept the space. Even there was a pack on the floor. Not ancient, not historical, modern, nylon. The kind sold in outdoor equipment stores in the last 10 or 15 years. One shoulder strap was torn. The zipper was open. She descended carefully and opened it. Inside, 2 empty water bottles, a first aid kit used, a journal, its pages swollen and stuck together with moisture, a small folding knife, and a photograph. A woman, smiling, standing at the entrance of a cave. This cave, she was almost certain. The photograph was laminated. On the back, written in ink that had bled but was still readable. Caro Negro, 2019. I will find the way. Elena held the photograph for a long time. She did not know what had happened to the woman in it. She did not know if she had found her way, or if she was still somewhere in the dark below. And what she knew was this. Someone else had been exactly where she was, had reached this point, had left these things. And the pack was here at the base of the crawlway she had just come through, which meant this person had descended from above. There was something above. Days 11 through 13, Elena moved upward. Every passage that angled up she took. She used the folding knife from the pack to mark her route. Small notches at each junction, always on the right wall, always at eye height. She was not going to get lost again. She was not going to make the same mistake twice. Her body was failing in measured clinical ways. She recognized the symptoms of early starvation, the dizziness, the way her thoughts arrived slightly out of sequence, the dreams she had begun to have while she was still technically awake. She rationed her water with even greater severity, down to 1 mouthful every 3 hours. She found small sustenance where she could. More cave fungi, the soft white growth on limestone that she recalled from a paper she had read years ago, was edible in very small quantities. Mineral water from seeps. She tried not to think about what she was eating. She thought only about the direction. Up. On day 12, she smelled something that made her stop breathing. Air. Moving air, carrying the ghost of a smell, green, organic, alive. Surface air. The cave breathed it at her like a secret. She stood in the dark and shook. The smell came from a passage so narrow she could not see where it led. A vertical crack in the limestone, perhaps 8 inches wide at its broadest point. She pushed her arm in. She pushed her face close and inhaled. And the smell was real. The air was moving. Somewhere beyond this crack, the surface existed. The crack was 8 inches wide. She was not 8 inches wide. She sat down. She looked at the crack. She thought clearly with the cold precision that had carried her this far. She could feel along the wall for weaknesses, limestone fractured in predictable patterns, and what was 8 inches in one place might open wider further along. She could use the folding knife to chip at softer material, though that would take time she wasn't sure she had. Or she could keep climbing and hope to find a wider connection. She chose to keep climbing. If she found nothing above, she would come back and try to widen the crack. That night, or what she measured as night by her internal clock, she allowed herself 1 full page of her notebook. She wrote to Sophia. She described the cathedral chamber. She described the mushrooms and the photograph and the smell of surface air. She wrote, I have made every decision as carefully as I could. I have no regrets about the decisions. Only about the crack in the entrance that I noticed and didn't report. She tore the page out carefully and put it in her shirt pocket close to her skin. Day 14 began with a choice that could have ended everything. Climbing a particularly steep passage the previous afternoon, she had spotted what appeared to be a second crawlway, higher up, partially obscured by a ledge. To reach it, she needed to climb approximately 4 meters of near-vertical limestone with no rope, no harness, and an ankle that had held but was swollen and unreliable. 4 meters. The height of a ceiling, and the distance between standing on the ground and standing on top of a single-story roof. In other conditions, trivial. In her current state, weakened, slow, in complete darkness except for her headlamp, it was the most dangerous thing she had ever contemplated. The alternative was to go back, to retrace her path down to the crack that smelled of surface air and spend days, maybe more, trying to widen it with a small folding knife. She didn't go back. She found her handholds with the methodical patience of someone who understands that rushing a climb on unknown rock is how people die. She tested each hold. She distributed her weight carefully. She moved up centimeter by centimeter, pressing her face against the cold stone, feeling its texture against her cheek. Halfway up, a foothold crumbled. She caught herself. One hand, it locked on a narrow ledge, her feet scrambling against the wall. The drop below her was real, not symbolic. She hung there for several seconds that felt much longer, and something inside her, not courage, she would say later, something quieter than courage, simply refused to let go. She found the next foothold. She completed the climb. The crawlway at the top opened after 6 meters into a passage. The passage angled upward. The air moved against her face with a steadiness that told her she was close. 20 minutes later, she saw gray light. Not bright, not dramatic, just gray. The color of overcast sky filtered through rock, the most beautiful color she had ever seen in her life. She crawled toward it without thinking, without planning, without anything except the pure physical drive toward light. And the exit was a gap between two boulders, perhaps half a meter wide, on a rocky hillside dense with moss and low scrub. She pushed through it. She lay on the ground outside, face down, and pressed her palms into the wet grass. She didn't move for a long time. The rescue team found her 4 hours later on the hillside, 3 kilometers from the original cave entrance. She was dehydrated, 12 pounds underweight, and had a sprained ankle that would require 6 weeks of recovery. They asked her how she had found the exit. She told them about the crawlway, the climb, the passage, the gray light. A cave researcher who later surveyed her route told her that the exit she had used was not on any map. It had not, as far as anyone could determine, been used before. They asked her about the pack. No missing persons report for Cerro Negro existed from 2019 or nearby years. No record of a solo female caver at that location. The photograph was analyzed. The woman in it was never identified. Elena kept the photograph. She went back to teaching. She went back to fieldwork eventually, though she no longer enters caves alone. She is careful, still. More careful than before, which is saying something. Her daughter Sophia, who was 7 when her mother disappeared underground and 8 when she came back, asked her once what it was like in the dark for so long. Elena thought about it for a moment. She said, "It was like being given a very long time to find out what you're made of." Sophia asked, "What are you made of?" Elena looked at her daughter for a long time. She said, "I'm still not entirely sure." That was the truest thing she could say. And somewhere in a cave in northern Spain, in a narrow crawlway between 2 chambers, there are 17 marks scratched into a wall by hands that no one has yet identified, beside fresh notches cut into the right side of the rock at eye height, and the folded page of a notebook that a woman left behind to mark the moment she decided to keep going. Whether she meant it as evidence or as a gift to whoever came next, she couldn't say. Maybe both.